Ahora tenemos la ponencia de Mike Hardy, profesor y director fundador del Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations de la Universidad de Coventry del Reino Unido. En este espacio, Mike analiza cómo reducir la polarización en contextos con fuerte fragmentación, con una presentación titulada Joining Up the Dots, Secret Cohesion in 21st Century. Is Mike there? Mike?
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
That's good.
Thank you for being with us, Mike. I'm Gianfranco Ferrari. I'm here with Tony Alba. We're co-chairs of the event. It's really a pleasure to have you with us in Lima, at least virtually. And having said that, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I hear you've had a very intense day and a very interesting set of discussions. I'm delighted to be joining you virtually. I'd much prefer to be with you, but that wasn't possible on this occasion. So please forgive me for my lack of Spanish. I'll just stay in English. And I want to tell you some of the impact and consequences of the research that I'm doing that relates directly to the challenges that you're discussing. And I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes with your permission, and then there'll be time for questions. And I hope my slides are not too complicated and that they of course will be available for you. We're living in a time, as our presenters have indicated, of great uncertainty and risk. The human species itself faces the prospect of extinction if we're unable to significantly change the ways in which our civilization is destroying our ecosystem. At the same time, the geopolitical balance of power is in flux as we transition from a unipolar world into something new. A lot of my work is focused on the changing world order, and I'm going to, however, try to focus down on your neighborhood, your communities, to try and bring some transfer of these ideas. Historically, as the Russian war in Ukraine, our war in Europe now, shows us the transitions I'm describing are characterized by heightened tensions, heightened competition, and more mistrust, and thus a high risk of further conflict. Now, society is peaceful, in my view, when it has institutions that are able to ensure that political and economic competition is managed without people resorting to violence to pursue their interests. For peace to be sustainable and self-sustainable, a society thus needs to have sufficient, robust social institutions to identify, channel, and manage disputes peacefully. As I reflect on some of these issues, I want you to think about the institutions and relationships that you have. Try and draw from my comments and challenge the context in which you are thinking, you're relating, and you're working. Now, we as academics or as policymakers, as practitioners, as world voyeurs, we can assist with the process that I'm describing. But if we interfere too much, we cause damage and potential harm by disrupting the feedback that's critical for what I call self-organizing. And self-organization to emerge and be sustaining. Every time an external intervention solves a problem, my being a clever academic or a policymaker that arrives with a fresh set of solutions, it interrupts the feedback needed to stimulate societal self-organization. So it won't be surprising to you that my thesis often draws heavily on the power of local relationships and of civil society as opposed to governments and political structures. The most effective international operations we've seen in our research are those which stabilize a situation and then allow local stakeholders to move forward. Now, my talk today is very much about social cohesion. This is what I mean by joining up the dots. We live in fragmented times. We live in separate developments, in small silos, in our little communities, in our nation states. But we live in a time also where we have choices, and we can make a choice between that continued fragmentation or a world of solidarity. And I know most of your conversation is about creating the conditions for sustainable progress, for stability and predictability where it's possible in the future. And I think that's more likely to come from being solid in the way we think. I'm going to do 4 things in my short talk. I'm going to refer very quickly, and I've already started, at some of the challenges that we face. And I want you to think of the challenges that you face. It's far from me to come and visit you, humbly as I do in Lima, in Latin America generally. You'll know more sharply than I as an observer the challenges you face. I want to say a little bit about positive peace, because it's research that we've been doing in my center that focuses on the conditions required to get a sustainable peace, one of your 5 Ps. And then I'd like to explore my own research on trust, on the importance of trust and trust building, and set out finally an agenda for change. There's no point my bringing you ideas, concepts, thoughts, research results if we don't convert those into an action, an agenda for change that you can take forward in your relationships, in your communities. The future will belong to those who are ready and those who understand a changed world. So what are the challenges we face? They're familiar to you, unfortunately, because we live them daily. A collapse of everyday life that we know, a collapse post-pandemic, post-structural changes in the global economy of income, of ways of living and ways of working. We live in an unrecognizable world. Connected? Of course we are. Much more with our internet and our travel, much more with mass communications. But it's an unfair world, and some of the connections are quite threatening and attack our vulnerabilities. And finally, we have a challenge in which the world community has developed a set of sustainable development goals, the SDGs. But they sometimes appear as a bit of a panacea, that if we can get all these 17 things mobilized, that we'll be in a better place. But that doesn't necessarily reflect my assessment of the world as a complex adaptive system. And we've seen through some of the struggles with the pandemic, how by solving one problem, by addressing one sustainable development goal, we might actually provoke more problems elsewhere. So who would know when we asked the scientists about how we could fight transmission of coronavirus, and they tell us to separate, to socially distant, to move apart, to keep clear, and you will lower transmission rates. They were correct. But how do we know that that would generate a whole new problem with mental health, with isolation, with loneliness, and with serious challenges in fragmentation within communities? Now we watch as academics, as policymakers, as practitioners, as just interested people, that some communities, some people, some nation states seem to cope better than others. Some appear more comfortable. And being comfortable is a critical first step in taking and creating opportunity. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about my ideas of how we can become more comfortable. And part of this is how we support leadership. Leadership is about making sense of these challenges and helping to make positive change. As I said at outset, we have a clear choice about our future. All of us, at all levels. We can have a choice about how we live. How often have we heard during the pandemic, during the financial crisis, of the bank collapse, during the ecological crises of climate change, how often have we heard that we're all in this together? This is an often stated mythology. We're not all in this together in the same way, and I'd like to explore how we can think more about that and take control of the challenges that that means. So positive peace. Social cohesion in the 21st century demands what I started with, defining how and why a society is peaceful and how can we get there. There's some really good analysis that's summarized on this chart. Let's say we haven't got time to go through these, they're a week at a time, but you can take away some of the issues. These are 8 issues that academics show you need to have in place in order to have a sustainable peace. And actually, I'd argue, in order to have all your 5 Ps, your commitment to people, to partnerships, to prosperity, and so forth. Looking at each of them, challenge how we are. How are we doing in your individual opinion about your governance, about your civil society, about your community? We need, academics will tell us, well-functioning government, clear, distributed leadership, operates efficiently, transparently, and open, that's representative of stakeholders across the community. If that's government of the nation state or it's government of a small charity locally. Secondly, we need equitable distribution of resources. We need societies which have fair distributions, not equal, equitable. We need a free flow of information. We must fight and resist the misinformation and disinformation that exists. We must have good relations with our neighbors, whether we like them or disagree with them or not. We must have high levels of human capital. We must have commitment to high levels of education for their skills. They are the essential asset upon which peace and sustainable stability is built. And we must have high levels of acceptance of the rights of others. As I said before, we might not agree with everybody, but we must accept people for who they are, because then they will accept you, and this will reduce the problems of living with difference and the conflict that we see so apparently everywhere. Corruption is a toxic problem within contemporary governance, and we must have very low levels of corruption. It's impossible to remove it altogether. Some people argue that's human nature and self-preservation. I'm not a particular fan of that argument, but low levels of corruption are an essential prerequisite of peaceful communities and peaceful societies. And we must have a sound business environment. We must be generating growth. We must be developing the prosperity and opportunities. So these pillars of positive peace, you can see, are very attractive. The challenge we have, of course, is that it's very unlikely we'll get all 8 of these mobilizing at the same moment in time. It would be rather like one of those circus clowns who had all these plates juggling at the same time. It's quite challenging. So my interest is, how do we cope when we're an imperfect community, an imperfect society? How can we cope with that? This is my third point about the need to reflect on trust. Where things aren't open and stable and predictable, where they're not clear and where they're complex, sometimes trust can replace the knowledge and certainty that is missing. Let's have a look at some of the issues that we've looked at in my research. I'm often asked, Mike, why is it that the political process, that governments can be so difficult and so useless? Why is it that we can't really develop some of the answers to our challenges by looking to government? Government's not the solution, we say, and we have lots of examples when we read our newspapers and experience everyday life. I explain this by looking at how government develops and how it operates. And this simple analysis, I hope, will help. Government normally represents a leadership of a country which is relatively unhappy and wants things to change. It has its campaign, its manifesto, it attracts its supporters. And they fall into different camps. I've observed many governments around the world who fall into this horizontal relationship between the view that anything is better than what we have now, through to the other end of the spectrum, a clear agenda, a clear vision for the future. There are many governments who argue that we have to have change. Some argue that any change is better. Some argue that they want change specifically in this direction. On the vertical axis on my simple diagram, we have those governments who are committed to building a future and those governments who simply want to destroy what we have in order to replace it. That leads us to different examples. In the top left quadrant, you see a government that says anything's better than that, than what we have now, and let's build something different, is what I call a high-risk strategy. This won't satisfy all players and all stakeholders. Similarly, a government that argues that anything is better than what we have now, so I'm going to destroy what we have now and something will pop up, that's what I call dangerously hopeful. There's too many of that in examples around the world. And those who destroy, even though they're clear about the future, is what I call destructive process. It's quite painful. You dismantle everything, even though you know where you're going is going to be better. You disrupt. So this fourth quadrant in the top right-hand corner may be more preferable, hugely difficult. This is one that says our government should have and develop a clear agenda and vision for the future by representing the views bottom-up of the stakeholders in the communities, and then should build towards it. And in this quadrant, the way we move forward is more important than where we go. The journey is more important than the destination. So I think this helps me understand why governments are failing quite often and in many places to be part of the solution to the challenges that we feel as ordinary people in everyday lives. Then we move on to building trust. Trust is a complex thing. It's about how you treat and how you build and develop and enjoy relationships with others. There's a lot of literature for academics around social capital that look at the extent to which communities, however diverse, are bonded and linked together in ways that cohere and that create the solidarity I referred to earlier. This social capital is what is often called horizontal trust between individuals. And you'll know from your own experience that there'll be circumstances and contexts in which you find yourself of low trust, where you find yourself in an out-group position, where there aren't many people that are similar to you. They're very different. They might be older or younger. They might have different faiths or religions. They might have different diets or languages or clothes. They might simply be ideologically very, very different. In this fragmented context, it's very difficult to develop trust. And you'll see at the other end of the horizontal spectrum, the position where you're surrounded by several people like you, with similar views, similar religions, similar diets, similar clothes, a great familiarity of in-groups where there are high levels of trust and solidarity. So where we find ourselves is somewhere on that spectrum. And when we identify where we are, we should begin to move ourselves in the right direction towards more solidarity. But identifying where you are is part of the issue, part of the problem. And there are many who argue that in horizontal social capital issues, there's too much denial of of the reality of where we are. Let's add the vertical trust, which is also critical, and I've referred a little to it already. The vertical trust is between individuals and institutions, between those who govern us and the governed. And on here, we've got an axis that ranges from a relationship where you as an individual feels very valued and engaged by your government, or one in which you feel very excluded and marginalized. Both are possible. One is far more desirable if we want more solidarity. But like my last analysis, when we put those together, our horizontal trust and our vertical trust, we can begin to examine what action we need to take to build trust as a relational process. How do we encourage ourselves by our analysis of the position that we're in? In a low trust scenario, and you might argue your current society is characterized by pretty low trust. Certainly low trust with government, a feeling that many are excluded and marginalized, and maybe low trust because of the levels of diversity, of difference, of inequalities, of deprivation, of low human capital. Some of the pillars of peace I referred to earlier are just not stepping up. In areas of high levels of trust, where you have a significant a degree of social capital within the economy, you still have a relationship with the government, which is critical. And it's really only where you hit this yellow top right-hand quadrant, where you have people feeling valued and engaged in a vertical sense with their governments, and people feeling comfortable with high levels of trust within a diverse community where similarities and common values are predominant. And this analysis is very simple, it's two-dimensional, but what it does is it sharpens our focus on what needs to change. And let me explore that a little bit further. Our agenda for change. I said that I'd conclude by setting out an agenda for how we can do things differently in order to encourage us to the places I referred to in my simple modeling. And I wanted to start with this famous piece of graffiti on a bar in Montgomery Street, which is a street on the waterfront in Belfast, in the north of Ireland. A place which has been fraught with tensions, with sectarian conflicts, with bitter civil war for many, many decades, and is now struggling to find a peace in real sense. So this was a piece of graffiti that appeared overnight, and they've now placed it on, kept it on the side of the building. A nation that keeps one eye on the past is wise. A nation that keeps two eyes on the past is blind. And what it is arguing passionately is that we must never forget where we come from, but we mustn't be obsessed with our past. We can't replicate and repeat it continuously and expect to do better. And I want you to bear that in mind. It might be a nation, it might be your community, it might be your employment organization, it might be your civil society. Keeping one eye on the past is a wise thing to do. Leaving the other eye, the other vision for a new tomorrow, which is much less predictable, much less certain. Trusted leaders do exist. When we observe them and we study them from the academy, we see some characteristics which are important. And I don't define leaders simply as heroes, as the most senior politicians or prime ministers or presidents. We're all leaders. We're all leaders if we help to make sense and make change, if we help to catalyze and mobilize change from the position we're in. So those leaders likely to be trusted and encourage others to trust will be those that cultivate a diversity of viewpoints and generate large numbers of options. A single solution is never an appropriate way of building trust, and embracing openness to a variety of options is more likely. Research shows that that's the case. Leaders are trusted when they lead with empathy, when they reward employees' performance with autonomy, not just bigger pay packets, with independence, with respect. Empathy is important, the ability to understand the feelings and emotions and beliefs of others. And finally, really important, a trusted leader finds winning solutions for all stakeholders. We know that there are winners and losers, but actually those who recognize that losers can also be respected and be supported are better and more trusted leaders. We know that from the research. So why, when we have research which shows why we have trusted leaders, why are there so many bad leaders, and why is there so much bad leadership around? Thinking more about that is important so that we can begin to build strategies for reducing it. Bad leadership is easier to find than good leadership, and that's terribly disappointing. Part of it's explained by hierarchy, that we have conditioned, stereotypical expectations of seniority. I'm an old guy and a young guy must wait his turn. So that often is the case, that we don't think outside the box. We're very traditional. Having two eyes on the past, believing in hierarchy, allows authority to continue to rule. We have a community full of bullies. Bullying is a common human characteristic. We have to fight it. Bullying is because there are those who are vulnerable. But more important, bullying takes place. This is the power plays and forced actions of some, because there are many bystanders that allow it to happen. We have senses of, social psychologists will tell us, of entitlement, intoxication and power, people who are born to rule, who are above the rules. We have often scenarios in which the results are more important than the methods. Results matter. And so the ends justify the means. Bad leadership prevails. And we have poor organizational processes. You'll know that. You have non-transparency or corruption. You have weak systems of accountability. And quite often also we observe in our research what I call powerless followership. Bit of a mouthful. When followers don't step up. And we'll come to look at that in a second. So what do we do when we have bad leaders? When you're a follower, you have to call it out. You have to challenge bad leaders. Call it out quickly and challenge early. In a careful way, not advocating for 1 minute that we should resort to more extreme and violent ways. There are ways of challenging bad leaders early and clearly. And quite often in our research, we observe bad leadership that isn't challenged and isn't called out because of power of hierarchy, of past practices, or whatever. These are changing cultural behaviors that are necessary to build the sustainable peace that we're talking about. So what to do? We need to set an agenda that supports. And I've had quite a race through a whole series of ideas, but we need to know more about some very basic things. We need to ask more questions about complexity and the adaptive systems that are created. We don't live in a complicated world. Well, we do, but actually we live in a complex world, one which is interdependent, unpredictable, unreproducible. We cannot respond tomorrow in the way that we did yesterday because tomorrow is entirely different. We need to understand that better. We need to be humble. Our leadership needs to reflect our hunger for learning about complexity. We need to understand power better. Don't take it for granted. Don't assume that we understand it well. Power is much more complex than currently is accepted and recognized. We must question the possibility of a solutions-based. We don't always have to confront the world through the lens of problems. We can sometimes encourage our leadership to look at solutions. Some will be good and some will be bad. Some will be perfect and some will be less so. And we have to deal with the question about empathy. If we have an empathetic world, we have a world which is more inclined to understand difference and to value other people's rights, to empathize and to be sensitive to the needs of others. And that leads us more likely to a solidarity which I describe as compassionate collaboration. A solidarity that's not joining things up for the sake of it, but is joining things up with a purpose, with a caring, empathetic purpose of compassion. My current research, where does this lead you, if you're interested, is to take these concepts, take these ideas, take these research outcomes and apply them to some very basic local, national, and even global systems. It's terrible. In 2022, and I discussed this on many occasions with my grandson, why is it that we have so clever people and clever systems have developed systems that are failing? The health system, designed to protect and preserve, to maintain our health and well-being, is clearly not working. I can't see a country in which it's successful. The financial system virtually collapsed in 2007 and 8, was bailed out by massive borrowing and massive support by governments. I don't need to tell you about the system that protects our planet and our failure of that system, and our failure even to recognize that we're failing. And most depressingly at one level, the system of government that we know is the best that we have, that of liberal democracy or that of democratic representative stakeholder participation, is simply not sustaining. And we're seeing the system of government itself failing, resorting within democratic structures to short-termism, which cannot cope with the complexity that we described. There's a multitude of ideas to unravel. I have a very short time, and please forgive me for rattling through some of these important ideas, but I want to stimulate you to think. You have the ability to make these choices and changes and to reflect more on some of these ideas. 8 changes on my list. Does leadership ask the right questions? When you get into a position of influence, do you draw on the right issues? Do you look forward or do you look back? Can leadership, secondly, deal with complexity? I think it's very poor at complex contexts. Does leadership deliberately cultivate trust, both horizontally at social capital or vertically with institutions? Do governments wake up in the morning and say, do my people trust me? And if they don't, what can I do about it? Is that important? Is leadership agile? And is it adaptable to the sorts of changes that it needs to be? Does it engage with the whole? We must be less leader-centric. Active engagement, not just with the supporting groups, but with everyone. How well does leadership manage loss? Involves managing and making meaning of loss and suffering. When you're successful, there will be losers, whether it's in distribution, whether it's in deindustrialization. How well do we deal with that? How well do we deal with the automotive industry of petrol-driven cars when we replace them all with electric cars? How does leadership relate the local to the global? Things that happen at a very local level have consequences globally and vice versa. How do we be less tribal and more and less unilateral in our actions? And how much, finally, does leadership invest in continuing and self-learning? The leadership I'm talking about in these 8 points as you, in your families, in your communities, in your neighborhoods, in your towns and cities, in your nation states, and after all, in our world as a whole. Solidarity and social cohesion helps. It's better practice for the way we operate and the way we behave. Just so a few final comments. We must expect change. Don't be surprised by it. But let's, in our solidarity, think about our behaviors, not structure. We can change structure. Structure adapts and changes itself on many occasions. It's behaviors that are much more telling and much more difficult. How do we encourage us to listen to multiple opinions, to look in what I call the peripheral vision rather than simply blinkered ahead? How do we use rules that help us and recognize that we can break them when it matters? And how do we break them? What the mechanism? Do we reform rules and change them? How do we mobilize all the strengths in society? How do we find strength in very unexpected places? How do we reward accomplishment, achievement, success with autonomy? You did well, Mike. Here's more freedom to experiment, innovate, and do some more. These are really difficult issues that are consequent of a world that builds around solidarity and cohesive societies. Final thought of prerequisites for positive change. I'm doing some work now around what I'm calling my 3 A's, and it really reflects on, these are 3 words with the letter A that starts them off, and they reflect more about behaviors than structures. And there are 3 things that when our world is imperfect and when our pillars of positive peace are not delivered, and when we fail to encourage a trusting context in our communities, there are 3 things we can still do that my work argues can make a difference. It's in our power to do. The first is to grow the concept of acceptance. When you wake up in the morning, when you wake up and influence your family, your community, your organization, encourage acceptance of the rights of others, of the views of others, of the feelings of others, and expect them to accept you. The biggest risk to human security is our difference with others. Whether this is religious age, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's ideology, economy, whatever, levels of affluence. It's difference that seems to cause us such conflict. And acceptance is something we can do that can change that in a measured, small way. My second A is anxiety. Much of the discussion of challenges describes a world that's really quite anxious. I have anxieties all the time. Don't think of anxiety, is my homily, as a negative thing. Let's think of anxiety as a positive force. Being anxious helps us to focus, helps us to set an agenda for the things that need to change. Anxiety isn't fear. It's highlighting the things that we need to focus on to change. So promote acceptance. Promote anxiety as a positive force. And my final A is about anger. And let's get rid of it completely. Anger is of no benefit to anyone. So anger management should be a priority if we're to build more trusted, more positive, socially cohesive. Anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. So we have these 3 things that we can change through acceptance, through anxiety, and through removing anger. I've listed here some of the inspirational things that I've been reading over the last 3 to 4 months, and these capture some of these issues. And this isn't a reference, these are simply inspiring words from thoughtful people. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mike. When I was listening to your talk, I was thinking a lot about populism and how populism is a specific, like one dimension of populism is the denial of complexity. So you have this very difficult problem of migration, and an answer to a very complex problem is Donald Trump saying, let's build a wall. Here in more a Peruvian context, there is a massive structural problems with the pension system, and the answer is, let's destroy the private system and the private system of pensions, and let's also destroy, by the way, the public system of pensions. So for me, populism is like denying complex things, and this is exactly what you mentioned. I was wondering if you have some thoughts on how social media is contributing to that. So you have, in a tweet, you have lots of fake news. So I know that internet and the digital era is amazing, has a lot of progress for the human being, but I also see how social media is really poisoning the discussion on complex issues and is also generating a lot of polarization. So I was wondering if you can give some thoughts on that.
It's a really interesting question, and thank you for focusing on. This is one of what I call a malaise of our times. You know, in 2022, if you were to ask me what's the biggest issue that we face of all the issues, whether it's climate or inequality, I think populist government is probably what I would answer. And the populist government is fueled by some of our imperfections. You mentioned the imperfections of global information flows, the disinformation and the misinformation that exists, that's used. But populism is actually one of the weaknesses or consequences of our failing systems of democracy. We've reached a stage in which people accept that the democratic system appears to be the best way of organizing it. I'm not a political scientist, but I haven't come up with a better one from my observations. But nonetheless, what the democratic system that we currently employ does is rely on very short-term periods between moments when governments ask people for their support, the elections that come around every 4 or 5 years. And that creates the need to generate quick solutions, simple solutions to what we know are fundamentally complex issues. Let me tell you one, which is less controversial and less contested, but we're confronting at the present time in the UK. In the United Kingdom, we have a problem with our railways. You'd have thought that the railways were a fundamental part of national infrastructure, of national economy, of the joining up of different parts of our small country, small in comparison with some. But the ideology of populist political ideology took a way of funding the railways by applying pure capitalist models, and they were privatized. We divided them up into different companies. Some did the west, some did the east, some did the north, some did the south. Separate companies became private enterprises. We expected in this democratic process of expecting people to support one ideology or another, that the application of private capital would lead to more successful railways. Who bought the railways is really interesting. Who are the owners of the private companies in the UK? A combination of governments from other parts of Europe. So some of our private railway companies are owned by the German government or by the French government or by the Italian government. And the fragmentation of our system has clearly failed, but it satisfied a popular need for an ideology that was pushed at the time for small government and for market forces. There are many examples. The health service is another one. But populism reflects, I think, a malaise of some of the pillars I referred to in my chart of eight things. It is enabled and supported by inadequate levels of human capital generally that can discern between short-term and long-term solutions, that can understand the different complexities. And it's simply an instrument and used to secure political power over short-term time periods. We know that the problem of global migration cannot be solved by building walls, because migrants are either very desperate or very clever, one or the other. And desperation and intelligence finds ways of overcoming barriers such as walls or visa controls. We have to be much, much cleverer than that. But migrants, the problem of migration, which you cited, can't be addressed if we start the discussion around the threat that a migrant brings to you in your family, to your job, to your housing, to your health service. And when they're presented in that way, we're not talking about the solutions, we're talking about the problems. And I made a point somewhere in my complex ramblings that actually we need to get into solutions agendas rather than problems. And that's the way forward to counter the populists. Populism lives and dies by solutions, and by promoting solutions that are quick fixes to the problems. They don't look at the complexity of longer-term transformational solutions. It's an enormous area that you've opened up. I'm sorry if I've not been clear enough in some of my thinking on it.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike, for your presentation. It's been very thoughtful, and personally, I'm still processing all the messages and digesting them. However, you showed us a chart regarding the horizontal trust and vertical trust, and without obviously being an expert, I would say that Peru is in the lower left quadrant, the pink one, where it is low trust, which is a fragmented, let's say, society, and on top of that, we feel excluded and marginalized by the government. On top of that, trust is something that is built little by little, but can be destroyed in a second. What are your thoughts about, as a country, as a society, as a private sector, what can be done in order to start moving out of that quadrant and trying to move to the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side of the quadrant, as a country, I mean?
So I agree with you. I think the purpose of developing or using a very simple model is to allow us to focus on some of the simple things that we need to understand. I think we are exactly there. I think, generally speaking, we live in a very low trust context, and we're normally ignored by our governments to varying degrees. I think my assessment of European governments, along with Latin American and South American governments, suggests that that's not uncommon. So what do? We have to move, as you say, step by step, slowly. We can be aware that the top right-hand quadrant feels a better place to be. And I think the answer was in some of my other comments, in the choices we make about our behaviors. And I think there's one thing that I think is very difficult to be compelling about and to be convincing about, and that's the notion of reciprocal relationships. Trust requires you to understand that if you change your behavior towards me, I will behave differently towards you. And this is a big, risky assumption in the 21st century, not helped by the way our governments lead and the way they give us incentives, encouragement. So one of the things we must do is try and develop a conversation that says reciprocity will happen, that this isn't automatically impossible, but it will happen. And the only way we can push that along is to begin to be giving first and taking second. So the only way to develop reciprocity is to take risks, to innovate, to implement out-of-the-box thinking. So my notion of acceptance and anxiety and removing anger is something that you can do as an individual. And my assumption is, research that we're showing, is that if you behave in a more accepting way, if you focus your behavior on the anxieties you have around your family or your needs, and if you remove anger from your toolbox, then you will become a different person and encourage others to do the same by your role model. You might think this is quite spy in the sky, but actually there's no reason to suggest why the mobilization of such solidarity behavior shouldn't work. And there's certainly evidence that it has in some contexts. I did a piece of research once in Mongolia, really interesting. Let me just share quickly, if I may. In Mongolia is a tiny country, part of the former Soviet Union that got its independence along with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a country of about 5 million people, where there are more horses, by the way, than there are people. And in this country, it has, by international observers, a hugely successful democratic political process. So the governments and the elections that have been introduced since their independence are recognized by the international community as very good. But for years and years, for 70 or 80 years, the people in Mongolia didn't trust their government, because the government for many years, of course, was detached far away in Moscow. So there was a culture of mistrust of government. And now that it has its democracy, we were doing work there on how to build trust, because they have 27 political parties. Nearly everybody that stands for parliament is known, has an in-group, is part of the neighborhood. It's a local boy or girl made good. But the minute they become a member of the parliamentary assembly, they're not trusted. They're classed as a stereotypical politician. And how do you change that? It's going to take ages. And it's right throughout the society. It was a really interesting issue. And the way you encourage trust is by beginning to legislate, beginning to regulate, beginning to educate people that around these sort of common characteristics. So, but it's a long-term process. And as you so rightly said, trust you can lose in seconds, and it takes decades to rebuild and re-equilibrate. But we need it, because our structures and our challenges are imperfect and unpredictable. And it's only with higher levels of trust that we can cope with the global imperfections of our complex world.
Mike, I have one question. Most of my life, I have been a public servant. I have thought a lot about how we can build trust within the citizens and government. And I want to validate my approach in some way. If we think, for example, about maternal mortality, for me, and then in some regions of Peru, maternal mortality is horrible. And I was wondering if the health system is not able to avoid the fact that you as a woman can die delivering a baby, doing something so natural of a woman. Like if a health system cannot avoid that you die there, you can't trust at all the government, you cannot trust the state. So I was wondering if as a country we need to, and this is trying to think about an incremental approach, trying to think about those 2 or 3 public services that are really, really fundamental to citizens, and try to master that delivery and then continue moving forward. So I don't know if that is the correct way to see this.
Well, it's a good example of my call for changing behaviors rather than structures, focusing on behaviors. So let's take that case. This is tragic, of course, when the health system fails to support this hugely significant emotional thing of infant mortality. But if you were appointed as the new head of a local hospital, what would you tend to do? What we tend to do are the wrong things. What we tend to do is have more nurses, have more beds, have better ambulances, have more drugs, have more equipment. In other words, we take a very structural approach to providing the services. When trust is actually, the research we know, if our patients trusted us, it's not because there are loads of nurses and lots of equipment and lots of clean beds. They trust us when certain behaviors become normal. Firstly, consistency. As the new head of the hospital, you should work on consistency so that the same things happen to the same standards over and over again. Ethics are important, so that the reason for actions are taken are ethical and clear. The competence is important, the qualifications of the nurses, not just the numbers of this, and above all, the predictability. So if you work on these behaviors, you're more likely to instill trust in the users of the service. But it's really difficult because most performance measures and metrics of hospitals are around their structures, the number of beds, the number of patients, the number of hospitals, the ratios. When I've always argued that the trust that's needed to have people confident in the system that their taxes pay for requires them to be behaviorally consistent, predictable, working with integrity and with competence, and delivering the services to the standards on a consistent basis. Better to have those qualities than the quantities that are more attractive to the metrics.
Thank you very much.
I think a lot goes down to education as well. I always believe strongly that human capital, the quality of the user, the human capital of the user, is a critical part of the performance of the service provider.
Mike, unfortunately, we're running out of time. I would like to, again, thank you for your excellent presentation. I would like to leave the audience with one of your messages. We need to give first and take second. It is obviously a risk, but someone needs to take the first step. Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Vamos a hacer un break para volver en unos minutos.
Gracias.